Welcome back to another Lawyer You Know video, and today we're going to discuss how local sheriffs are ignoring executive orders. All around the country today, as more and more lockdowns, shutdowns, curfews, and restrictions come down from governors across the country, we're seeing more and more local sheriffs and other law enforcement agencies totally ignore these executive orders. So today we're going to talk about how that's possible. Under what rules or authority can they totally ignore a governor, which is an executive officer, how they can ignore these executive orders?
Well, there's an old adage that even in the military, and this is where it started, you can ignore an illegal order. And these sheriffs have determined that this is an illegal order. Sometimes they've determined it's an illegal order as to its scope, which means, yes, we'll educate people, yes, we'll go around and talk to them, or sometimes they'll just say, look, we're just not going to have anything to do with it. Also, keep in mind, most sheriffs are elected. So they want to be popular so they get elected the next time around, and these masks or these restrictions are not popular.
So what we're talking about is executive orders across the country, most famously in California, but also in Arizona, North Carolina, Michigan, other states. The governors are rolling back out these restrictions. They're putting curfews on. They're shutting down businesses. They're shutting down restaurants. They're shutting down family gatherings for Thanksgiving and Christmas and other things. They're even shutting down some churches. And there's a lot of pushback by the citizens of these states. So even in these Democratic states that may lean far left or blue states with Democratic governors, the citizens of the state still don't want to shut down their businesses, shut down their lives, even with this public health emergency. They want to be able to make these decisions on their own, whether or not they want to go out or the citizens want to go out or where they want to eat or how they want to celebrate their Thanksgiving and Christmas. And some similar things are going on in Europe, and riots have started busting out, dealing with these restrictions and dealing with this government overreach, as they call it. And it's very interesting that even with these governors and these executive officers making these executive orders, a lot of local law enforcement just still continue to refuse to do so. And you're saying that they are ignoring these executive orders because they're calling it an illegal law. Do local law enforcement, do sheriffs have some sort of professional discretion or autonomy to choose which laws they are going to enforce and which ones they don't?
Well, I think you've got to start with the fact is a lot of these are saying these executive orders...
A lot of these who?
These sheriffs.
Okay.
These executive orders or proclamations are not laws.
Okay.
That's one argument that they're making.
Okay. And how so? Why are they saying that?
Well, because they're saying only the legislature can pass laws. Keep in mind, in this country, the basic premise when we first started the country out, we have checks and balances between three forms of government. We have the legislative, we have the executive, and we have the judicial.
And they all have their own separate powers, right? This is like second grade history or second grade social studies that our kids are learning now, or my kids, your grandkids.
They all take how to pass a bill. It goes to the legislature, it passes the legislature, then it goes to the executive for signature.
Even that is more advanced because when you just talk about it basically, the legislature writes the laws, the judicial branch interprets the laws, and the executive branch executes the laws, right? So everybody knows or should know when they learn in grade school that the legislative branch is the only branch that can create law. And at this point with these executive orders that have been flying like crazy by Trump now, by Biden saying he's going to have a bunch coming down, and all these governors, because of the pandemic, the executive orders and these executive branches creating law is just going crazy.
But unfortunately, what we learn in second grade is very simplistic. Basically, what's happening is legislatures are passing laws. These laws say governors have the right under emergency circumstances to create law to deal with the emergency. And by giving them that authority, that is what the legislature does. They did their job and they gave it to the executive. A lot of people argue you can't do that because that means the executive becomes the legislative branch and the executive branch together. But the courts have said they can do that. They can do some delegating under emergency circumstances.
So it's already gone through the legislative branch and the judicial branch to say that they have both, the other two branches have put the power in the executive branch's court, basically.
Yes.
Okay, so what kind of professional discretion does the sheriff's office have? We've done videos on smoking marijuana and how some local sheriffs, like our sheriff here in Pinellas County, is basically saying, we're not prosecuting gummies anymore, we're not prosecuting edibles, it's too hard for my officers, it's too hard to test, it's too hard to smell, whatever it may be, so we're just not prosecuting that anymore. Where does that discretion stop and where does it come from?
Well, they have the discretion, again, going back to the illegal order by saying these laws are illegal and they're unenforceable. We don't have the jail space. We don't have the courtrooms that can handle arresting everybody who doesn't wear a mask. So you just can't enforce it. A lot of people also don't realize is that when courts pass an order, let's say the Supreme Court says, you must do this. Because we're a system of laws, we do what the Supreme Court says. But you know, the Supreme Court doesn't have a police department. It doesn't have an army. It really couldn't enforce the laws if law enforcement decided, that's the Supreme Court, we're just going to ignore it. So you've got to have the cooperation of the local law enforcement. So when the sheriff says we're not going to enforce it, then that puts the governor in a bind, because then the governor has to make a decision. How do I enforce my own orders? And one way is they would remove the sheriff. Again, a totally unpopular decision and wouldn't get him any votes.
Well, they can also defund that sheriff's department or talk about changing the budget and how much money they give to
That would be the
what
legislative
county.
branch, yes.
Right, but that's what they can try to do, and that's what I've heard is they're threatening to defund certain sheriff's departments or local law enforcement departments that don't abide by and follow these executive orders. So we can see if that political struggle falls down in some of these states, but some of the citizens are really starting to uproar against it. So when you have some local sheriffs that are trying to exercise that discretion and are deciding to ignore these executive orders, and they're saying that it's an illegal order or unenforceable order or law. So what are some of the justifications that these local law enforcement officers, local sheriffs are using for saying that these executive orders are unenforceable or are unlawful?
Well, a lot of them talk about the First Amendment because we've got the individual freedoms in the First Amendment. And those freedoms, they are, let's face it, any of these executive orders abridge or limit the personal freedoms we have in the Constitution. And so they're saying, look, these are unconstitutional because they limit the freedoms of the Constitution. Again, a lot of courts have already said, you can't do away with these constitutional freedoms, but you can regulate them. Let's face it, we don't have the right to build a 5-story home where the county said you can only build a 2-story home. So there are limits that you can put. You can't yell fire in a theater. That's been a very common one. So
yeah, we limit our First Amendment right or freedom of speech. But they're saying a lot of these are limiting our right to gather, our right
to assembly,
assembly, our freedom of religion, and our freedom of speech sometimes. So how are they going to go back and forth in determining whether or not these executive orders do violate some of these constitutional rights? Is somebody else that has standing going to have to bring a lawsuit? Who's going to determine whether law enforcement or whether the executive branch is correct?
Well, eventually it'll probably go to the courts. The U.S. Supreme Court just recently had 2 rulings with reference to these restrictions that have been placed by governors. And both rulings went against the governors. They were both freedom of religion rulings. And they said that you can't limit, for example, a church attendance when you're not limiting how many people can go to a grocery store.
Right.
So there are freedoms.
Or there was one that like a church or some place, I can't remember if it was a church or restaurant, turned into a strip club because you could have more people at a strip club than you could into a church or something. There's all sorts of weird rules and they're just not applying it equally to religious gatherings and therefore they're violating the freedom of religion. Right. If they shut down everything and everybody had to stay in their home, then it would be equally shutting down everything for a public health emergency. But
then you would have the argument that what you're doing is you're not just limiting your freedom, but you're eliminating your freedom, right? So that's why the sheriffs are having a tough time. I really think the sheriffs are having a tough time more than anything else because in their heart, politically, they just don't believe in a lot of these restrictions.
I think it's different. I think that the biggest issue for the sheriffs, similar to the weed testing I just talked about at the beginning of the video, is they don't even know how to implement, enforce, and execute some of these executive orders. It's always changing. Some of the sheriffs may watch CNN, some may watch Fox. They may have totally different views on how serious this is or how they should attack this or what's even going on in the world that they don't even know how to implement this. They don't know from one day to the next how many people are allowed inside one space or how many people are allowed to be walking around or whether you have to wear masks or whether you can ask somebody why they're not wearing a mask if it's for a medical reason or whether you can't ask. I think it's so hard for the sheriffs to train their employees in how to enforce this law.
What about resources?
Right.
I mean, what about resources? You only have so many 911 operators. If you're going to have everybody calling and say, hey, my neighbor next door has more than 10 people there for Thanksgiving, If you've got to send a car out to every one of these calls, what about the serious crime that's going on the street? How are you going to enforce that? And if you've got to arrest these people, you bring them in. That's another problem. Is a lot of these
public health issue.
Executive orders have certain punishments. A lot of the punishments are jail time. They can be misdemeanors, or they can have their own specific jail time. So you've got to arrest them. You bring them into the jail. Can you imagine having all these people that violate the mask ordinance coming into the jail and being charged with a crime? Can you imagine what it's going to be like 30 days or 60 days from now when you have the court systems, which have been pretty much shut down because of the pandemic, having to deal with thousands and thousands of people arrested for not wearing a mask?
Yeah, and they're already letting criminals that have committed more serious crimes out for public health reasons. Now they're going to flood them with people that aren't wearing masks or are gathering with their family and Thanksgiving. I can't imagine a law enforcement officer, a decent law enforcement officer, that would want to go into somebody's house celebrating Christmas or Thanksgiving or whatever it may be with 20 of their family members and taking them to jail. That just makes no sense. I don't believe anybody that would want to be a law enforcement officer or that's a decent human being would want to do that. It just does not make any sense. And the governors are putting law enforcement officers in this position to make these calls when the governors themselves are not following these rules. The politicians are not following these rules. There's been so many stories. We'll put some links in the bio of these stories where the governors are also gathering with 25 people inside places. They're taking vacations. They're doing all this stuff, yet you're putting the people that are on the street, putting their lives at risk, already dealing with so many difficult situations on the street, already dealing with a lot of the protests and dealing with trying to have some kind of police reform. And now you're adding this into the mix. It's just impossible.
And a lot of the restrictions to the common man, frankly, don't make sense. For instance, I think it's California now that they're going to ban outdoor gatherings.
Right.
Well, there is no science that says that banning outdoor gatherings is going to have any impact on the spread of the virus. So the sheriffs know this has nothing to do with the science, that someone's just got some gut feeling that maybe it'll help to shut down the outdoor seating. And the sheriff said, look, I'm just not going to deal with this. I don't have to deal with it. I'm not going to deal with it. And the people that elected me don't want me to deal with it.
So how far does this go? If the sheriff is going to ignore the executive order and they're not going to arrest people for violating these executive orders, what's to stop the citizens from doing the same thing of all of these counties and all of these states, with just totally ignoring the executive orders, going out and living however they want, no masks, gatherings of 25 people, whatever it may be? Where does the domino effect actually stop?
Well, nothing, because the sheriffs really want to educate and have voluntary compliance. That really is what they want, because they don't want to arrest people.
But these sheriffs that are openly coming out and saying they're not going to follow this executive order,
well, they're
do
not
you
gonna
expect the citizens of those counties to actually follow the executive order?
I think more what they say is they're not going to arrest. They're not going to enforce them by arresting.
Right.
I don't think they say they're not going to try to educate the people and go by and say, look, please, don't have 25 people in your restaurant. Please don't do that. And I think that's what they're going to do and hope for voluntary compliance. But some of the other things, the side issues are, for instance, even though they don't have to arrest people, the zoning boards can come and lift licenses of business that have
there are
these
other
25
ways
people.
that
Right.
they can get at these businesses, right?
There's other things that can be done by these localities in order to do this.
So what is there that protects people in their own house or property that they own to be able to have however many people they want over or do whatever they want in their house? What protection do those people have? The people that are protesting things like you can't have your family members of more than 5 or 10 or 25 people in your house for Thanksgiving or Christmas.
I think we're going to have an interesting time in about 3 to 6 months when these cases come to court and the constitutional arguments are presented that in my own home you can't restrict me.
Right.
Where the government is going to say, look, this is an emergency, it's a health emergency, we have the right to make certain limitations on your personal freedom. That's going to be really interesting arguments. I got to be honest with you, I tell you what's going to happen. When this, hopefully next year, when this calms down and everybody gets their vaccines, I think that the local prosecutors are going to drop any charges that come along because it's just not going to be worth it.
Yeah, and I read some state representative was saying that the constitutional rights that we have are not absolute, and nobody ever said that they couldn't be restricted. Nobody ever said they couldn't be refined, which, I mean, sounds scary, but That's what's happening, and that's what we're seeing. And Thomas Jefferson, the famous Thomas Jefferson quote said that if a law is unjust, a man is not only right to disobey it, he's obligated to do so. And that's what some of the protesters now are really sticking to as they protest this government overreach, or what they feel is government overreach, similar to what's happening in Europe right now. So hopefully we get this all calmed down. Hopefully the coronavirus goes away. Hopefully we don't have to deal with this for much longer. But it is very interesting that law enforcement officers can totally ignore executive orders without much pushback, and we'll see what the courts say about it in the future.